Today we have a lavalier mic that's new, but we need another cord. So today I just have to use my teacher voice without a microphone to do the introduction. But anyway, welcome. If you were fortunate enough to be here on Saturday night, this past Saturday night, you got to see the 10th anniversary presentation for the PERLAC, Park Rapids Lakes Area Arts Council, had all different groups presenting, and one of the presenters was Julie Kaiser. And Julie is going to be doing for us a one-woman play on Friday night, October 23rd. And what that play is a story of the life of Zelda Fitzgerald, the wife of F. Scott Fitzgerald. She actually said, well, he did have a drinking problem, so sometimes they called him F. Scotch Fitzgerald. But anyway, so she will be presenting that, and we have tickets for sale. If you buy them in advance, they are $12.50, and if you come just to the door, they are $15, so be sure to get your ticket. We also have our author selling books out there too. So anyway, Friday, October 23rd, 7 p.m., right here. Okay, so we started hearing about Wendell Affield's book a couple of years ago, and our sister organizations up north of here in Bemidji told us he presented to them and how excited they were to have him. So we've been working for a while on getting Wendell here to share his experiences in Vietnam. And many of us are of that Vietnam generation, so a lot of the things he's going to talk about we'll remember having heard about on the news. Well, now you get to have an up-close, personal look by Wendell Affield. Welcome.
Dell told me not to have this on when I went to the bathroom, so I forgot. He said everyone will know. I want to thank the Headwaters Center for Lifelong Learning for having me here this afternoon, and thank Marty for the correspondence back and forth organizing this. I know there's some veterans in the room. Could you please raise your hand? Thank you for your service. You know, when we came back, we didn't get that. And today, we're almost overwhelmed by hearing it. So I think sometimes there's got to be a happy medium. When I got out of the service in 1969, I had trouble finding a job. I had two brothers living down by Chicago. I was raised on a farm up north of Bemidji. And with my brothers down there, I decided to try life down there because there wasn't much in 1969 up in Bemidji for a person for a living. And so I started job searching down there and had trouble finding anything. Eventually I landed a job as an apprentice meat cutter. And 30 years later, I ended up retiring from that business. And last 15 years I managed a butcher shop at Lucan's Village Foods in Bemidji. Well, during those 15 years, from about 1985 to 2001 when I retired, a lot of folks knew I had been in the service. I didn't talk about it really. But during those years, a lot of times World War II vets would come in with their wives shopping, and the veterans would stop by the meat department and visit with me. And during those years, about 3, 4, 5 times, these old fellows started telling their story of trauma. And I heard many, many stories from veterans, but these few times stuck out in my mind because these men, and I had known some of them since I was a little kid, would choke up with tears in their eyes and just walk away shaking their head, not finishing their story. And I didn't understand that till just the last few years, that two things I came to realize. It was probably the anniversary date of their trauma of when they had been wounded or captured or been with a friend that was killed. And odds are it was the first time they had ever tried to tell anyone about it. And those stories sadly went to the grave with them. And I guess one message I would have for all veterans, that we all have a story to tell. I have a friend down in the cities that he was in the Army in the mid-50s during the Cold War. And he was stationed in Germany, and he didn't have any war stories to tell, but he wrote just an amazing book. I wish I had it with me. I've loaned it to someone. But it is a history book. He wrote it kind of for his children. It's a history book. It's full of pictures. It's full of anecdotes of time, events and things that he did in Germany. A lot of humor in it. But it's the story that he left for his children and grandchildren. If he hadn't written that book, those stories would be gone. Well, when I came back, I was wounded in medevac home, and in winter 1968, I came home on convalescent leave, and my younger brothers and sisters wanted to hear war stories. Well, I instinctively knew you don't tell war stories. And so I started telling them stories of my SEER training, that's survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training that we had before we went to Vietnam. And I was telling them about how we were put on this island off the coast in Puget Sound, and without any food, and we had to eat whatever we could find. And about the second day, and we were separated into boat crews, so there were 7 of us in the group I was with, and we were smart enough to trap minnows in the outgoing tide. And I said how we ate the minnows raw. And my youngest brother, Danny, he said, people don't eat raw fish. And I said, yeah, well, we did. He said, I dare you to eat my goldfish. So he took his little dipper and dipped it out and put it in my hand, and I popped it in my mouth and ate it. Well, 50 years later, that is his memory of my time in Vietnam, that I ate his goldfish. I was in the Navy from 1965 to 1969, and I did one tour on a destroyer in 1966, and I went back on a riverboat in 1968. And it was a unit that was formed, the Mobile Riverine Force, was a combination of Army and Navy. It was a 9th Infantry, mostly 2nd Brigade. There was some 3rd Brigade that operated with us. And the reason that unit was formed is because the Mekong Delta is only about 2 feet above sea level. And when the tide comes in and during the monsoons, there's even less ground. So during the dry season, we had to be careful going up the narrow channels and off the tributaries of the Mekong, because if the tide went out, it was easy to get grounded and you had to wait for the tide to come back in. And on the other hand, during monsoon season, there were thousands more miles of navigable waters. Oh, I need my little pointer. Okay, gotta bear with me here.
It's maybe not on.
Pardon?
It's maybe not.
Marty, good thing we have a technician here.
Let's see.
Oh, there.
Turn it on. Okay, now it should work.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. This is a view from the boat captain's station going upriver, and I have this picture. I actually used this picture on the front cover of the book. But this is a pretty typical width of the rivers we operated on. The Mekong River itself is very wide at its mouth. It's kind of like the Mississippi down in New Orleans. But this is what we normally operated on. This is the boat that I served on. Well, it's one identical. You can see the name, the number on it, Tango 91 something. This picture was taken from our boat. It's identical to the one that we were on. We had a 7-man crew, as I mentioned earlier. These boats were converted World War II landing craft, LCM-6s. And some people might recognize that bow ramp, but otherwise they were completely retrofitted with armor plating. Who's that pointer, Marty?
Oh, it's, it's this thing right here.
Oh, okay, perfect. But we had two forms of armor plating. The first was, it was like bar armor welded 1.5 inches apart, and it was offset from the 1-inch armor plating about 2 feet, and it was designed to detonate rockets before they struck the actual armor plating. We had a mine-sweeping gear right here. That's the reel that the cable is on. And that was one of our more important functions, was to sweep the rivers for mines. I'll talk about that later. And we had heavy armament. We had a 20 millimeter cannon right here. We had two 50 caliber machine guns, one port and one starboard. And mounted above those two machine guns was an early version of the Honeywell grenade launcher, and ours was hand cranked. The later versions were more like automatics that were gas operated. You just pulled the trigger and they fired. And the way you aimed those, they were mounted right on the 50 caliber, and so you'd hold the handle of the 50 to determine the elevation of the trajectory of the 40 millimeter grenades. And down in the well deck here, excuse me, ooh, don't do that. Down in the well deck here, we had 4 30 caliber machine guns. And in this picture, it kind of looks like we're heading out on an operation. You can see we have a platoon of troops down in the well deck. They're covered with this canvas awning to keep the weather off of them mainly. As far as crew positions, where this fellow's standing, this was the boat captain's position when we were at battle stations. Whenever we'd go up narrow rivers, everybody got in position where they need to be. In the brochure it mentioned I was going to talk about distinguishing the population, enemies and friends. We never had that problem because the months that I was there, we never took the first shot. We always were in ambushes just because of the nature of our situation. I drove the boat, and I was down in this little compartment right here. This was the coxswain flat, and I had 1-inch armor plating with the bar armor offset, and my armor plating hinged open. So when we were in the wide river like we are right here, I'd have the armor plating open because it was extremely hot there, and so any ventilation you could get was you were thankful for it. We had the 3 gunners mates, one for each turret, and then we had an engineman and responsible for the mechanical and electrical functions on the boat. And he generally was down in the well deck by the troops, and he would man one of the 30 caliber machine guns. And this looks like we're kind of heading out on a mission with this load of troops, and the boat is sitting pretty low. There we go. I took this picture in San Diego about 15 years ago. My wife and I were there for a Mobile Riverine Force Association reunion, and they were doing a dedication out on Coronado of one of our old boats they had salvaged. And I climbed up on it and took this picture from the boat captain's view down into my coxswain flat. This is where I was. I didn't have a fancy helm like this. Mine was just smooth metal with a wooden rim on it. The 2 shifts on the boat were right here, port and starboard. They were kind of like upside down stirrups. And you'd hold the shift, and forward was forward naturally, and down was reverse. And you controlled the RPMs by actually twisting that stirrup. So you could do 2 things at one time. You move forward or back and also control the speed. This is yours truly here in 1965. I was 17 years old when I went to boot camp. And here I am being a tough guy in 1968. This was our very typical uniform. It was extremely hot. On the boats, we lived on the boats. We had just hammocks on them. And so we just wore shorts, and I was quite often just barefoot or wore like flip-flops, shower shoes. And we did our bathing and right in the river. So we kind of kept our clothing, our laundry to a minimum. One of the things I'd comment on this picture, I have a .38 caliber revolver on. I'm left-handed, and when I did go ashore, I would wear it, and I'd always take a 12-gauge shotgun with me. But we had personal weapons on the boats. We had M16s and two 12-gauge pump shotguns and two .38 calibers revolvers. This is a typical view from the boat captain's position. We're just heading out on an operation. There would usually be about a dozen of our boats on an operation. And we would usually leave our motherships in the big river about midnight or 1 or 2 in the morning and take off. And by sunrise, we'd be getting hopefully close to where we wanted to be. And my view from down in the coxswain flat, like I say, I had the 1-inch armor plating, and I had just slits in that armor. So my view of what was going on was quite limited. This is our boat captain, Buddha Ed Thomas. And I'll tell you a little funny how he got his name. We trained in Mare Island. That's, we trained.
Cover the mic.
Okay.
Cover the mic, yeah.
Okay. We trained in Mare Island. That's near San Francisco and Vallejo. And we went up in the Sacramento sloughs. And on the naval base there was an EM club, and most of us weren't old enough to drink yet, but they figured if we were old enough to go to Vietnam, we were old enough to drink. And so we'd go in there, and in the evening, the old lifers would kind of be on one side of the club, and us youngsters would be on the other. But our boat captain, Buddha, he was pretty vocal. And he dominated conversations quite a bit. And he loved his whiskey and Coke. And one night he was sitting there kind of half dozing off, and he was a very big man. And he was leaning forward, and his double chin was hanging down. And another boat captain, Jimmy Austin, started laughing, and he says, "Ed," he says, "you look like a Buddha statue I saw in Kyoto a few years ago." And Ed looked up and started to put on a smile like he thought a drunken Buddha might have. And he liked that name, and so he started signing his papers Buddha Ed Thomas. And it wasn't until about a month or 2 later, our radioman, who we nicknamed Professor because he was a college graduate, informed him that he was spelling Buddha wrong. He didn't have an H in it. So he figured it out. This is another type of boat that was in our squadron. We call these monitors. Some folks referred to them as ironclads, kind of like the Civil War ironclads, because they had basically the same armament we had, but they didn't haul troops. Where their well deck was, they had extra armor. They had a 40 millimeter cannon. You can't quite see it in this picture. And they have an 81 millimeter mortar. And some of them actually carried flamethrowers. Okay, the later versions, I didn't see any of those on here. But an important thing they had right here was a radar dome. And like I said earlier, at night we'd leave and midnight whenever, and it was extremely black. There weren't many yard lights in South Vietnam. And so going up these narrow tributaries, it wasn't unusual to run into the river banks or overhanging vegetation. And each boat had a masthead light on it right here. And we didn't have our regular running lights. It was just a light on the top of that. And that's what we would follow each other on. And the monitor would lead the parade with the radar, and you better keep up with him, because in the fog or the drizzle during monsoon times, it was easy to lose them, and it was quite embarrassing to get on the radio and tell them to wait while you caught up. This is one of the, I mentioned flamethrowers earlier. This is one in action here. They were called Zippo boats, okay, kind of like the old Zippo lighters. And they were very lethal. They would, the enemy, the Viet Cong, would basically dig bunkers into the riverbanks. And so it was almost impossible, even like with the 20 millimeters and 40 millimeter cannons, to break through their bunkers. But quite often they'd leave them open on top. So either the napalm from these or the grenades that we fired from our Honeywells would detonate, or the napalm would drip down from the foliage above the bunkers. One of the things that we were taught during our training was that when we got in an ambush, that to turn the boat and you would ram the bunkers, okay, and me driving the boat, that was one of the things that I did. And when you rammed the bunker, then you would drop the ramp naturally to let the troops off. Some of you probably remember Khe Sanh offensive during Tet in 1968. I got into Vietnam early in February 1968, and in March they transported a squadron of our boats up to the Qua Viet River, which is near the border of the DMZ with North Vietnam, because it was one of the main ways of supply. That was one of the supply routes for getting supplies to Khe Sanh. LSTs would come in, the ships would come in to the naval base at the mouth of Qua Viet River and offload, and then large landing craft, LCM-8s, would bring them upriver about 8 miles to Dong Ha, and from there they were flown in or transported into Khe Sanh. And the North Vietnamese had artillery just across the DMZ, and to this day I shake my head when we were always told that they were dug into mountains. Well, we couldn't see any mountains where we were. But between 7th Fleet offshore shelling and air support, they could never knock artillery out. And almost every day this base would get shelled, almost every day, and at night. And sometimes it would be random, so you never felt safe. What we would do up here, we'd go out early in the morning and make a mine. We'd sweep for mines up to Dong Ha. We'd have 5 boats on each side of the Qua Viet River. And then at the end at Dong Ha, we turn around by the bridge. There's been books written about the bridge on Highway 1 in Dong Ha. Anyway, we'd turn around, and then boats would drop off all the way along so to patrol the river during the day. And in the evening, then we'd all come back and sit at the base at Qua Viet for the night. And the Marines had a beer club there, and our crew was split into halves, so 3 of us were always on the boat. And sometime there would be an LST in there late offloading cargo, and we would be fortunate enough to get up there and eat some decent food for a change and to take a hot shower, and that was really a joy. But this particular shelling, it happened at night, and this is the next day. It was just crazy. These LSTs would offload their cargo, and a lot of times the LCM-8s that would go up to Dong Ha, they were sitting right there, so the forklifts would come off the ship and put them right onto the utility craft, and they'd take off. But later in the day, they would just start building up supply piles on the staging area. And it seemed like the Viet Cong or the NVAs would just wait for that staging area to get full of supplies, and then they'd really shell it heavy. And that's what happened in this situation. This burned for about 3 days with ammo cooking off and fuel bladders and everything. One morning, it was just shortly after we got up there, and when we go up that first mine sweep of each morning, we take turns being the front boat. So the front position was kind of a suicide position because you had to drive over the mine before your sweep gear would snag the wiring leading to the bank where it was triggered, if it was command detonated. And I was second in column right behind this boat. I was maybe 70, 75 yards behind it. And I was just kind of looking ahead, doing my thing, through the slits in my armor, and this one sailor on this Tango 7 came to the fantail to pee, and all of a sudden the boat flew up in the air. And to this day, I could swear I saw daylight underneath the boat for an instant, and it just slowly flipped over upside down. And 6 of the 7-man crew got killed. And the one sailor that was on the fantail, he did survive. He was badly damaged and broken up, but he was medevaced out. A couple days after this happened, first early pictures, when the mining happened, we pulled up to the bank. Our boat was only about 3 or 4 feet from this one when it first got mined. And shortly after that, Marine helicopters came in and they secured the area. And they had trouble retrieving the bodies, so a day or two later, a marine tank retriever came, and from the bank they hooked a cable on it, and they turned the boat over so it's sitting upright in this picture. That's 2 of the 250 caliber turrets sitting there. And they wanted to retrieve the guns so the NVA wouldn't get them. This is a picture of them securing the area. Like I say, there's some Marine choppers there. They brought divers in trying to get the bodies out and everything, and they had some issues with that. Actually, they didn't find 2 of the bodies till 2 days later they surfaced. This is one of those landing craft utilities, the bigger ones I was talking about. This one actually struck a mine just before we got there. And when I started writing my stories, after I retired, I started going to BSU because I knew I had stories I wanted to tell. And this was actually kind of the first story that I told, because I ended up pulling a body from the river that was one of the crewmen from this boat, and it happened like the second day we were up there or whatever. And probably the reason I wrote that story first, and I call them my memory stories now, because it was such a powerful memory, and smell is such a powerful memory trigger. This is our boat, and it's a pretty good picture of it, just beached along the Quaviette River. The ramp that we lowered, I actually controlled that from the coxswain flap. And it was on a cable, it was electrical, like a winch, and there was a manual safety latch that was actually on the ramp also. And our engine man was responsible to release that manual latch. And the reason for that was if you were just cruising up the river and the cable snapped, that ramp would drop down and you'd be submerged within moments. Here we are again up in Quaviette, just sitting high and dry. The tide is out. We're doing some maintenance. You can see where we scrape the hull. A lot of junk would build up on it, so we try to scrape it every week to 10 days. One of the other things we had problems with, because these were, keep in mind, 20-year-old boats, they leaked. And underneath the well deck here, there were 3 compartments. And they were each sealed, but each one of them we'd have to take the plate off and pump them out about every 3rd day, because the boat would ride lower and lower in the water. And they were to begin with, so being in shallow rivers, sometime you needed as shallow a draft as possible. In early July of 1968, we were all sent back down to the Mekong Delta. And shortly after we got down there, we went on an operation down in the Khao Mai Peninsula. It's a very southern part of South Vietnam. It's about 600 miles from the equator. And it was so hot, and the mosquitoes were so horrid. Think of the worst day you've ever had with mosquitoes in northern Minnesota and multiply that about 10 times. That's how the mosquitoes were constantly 24 hours a day. And so sometimes down there we'd revert to long sleeves and pants. But the people down in this area hadn't seen foreigners since the French left in 1954. So I'm going to read a couple of pages here. No, we're good. Okay, and in this passage here, we've just I'll stop reading. But we've dropped off our troops, our platoon of troops, and they're making a sweep inland on a search and destroy mission. And we've moved upriver to wait for them to come back out to the riverbank. And we happened to beach right in front of a fisherman's hooch. Buddha sent me and a couple other guys ashore to check the hooch out to make sure it wasn't a bunker. Anyway, the front yard was bare dirt, sugar sand and black delta silt. Flies rose sluggishly as I approached the little house. It was a one-room hut, no door, constructed of vertical small posts, covered with bamboo and grass thatch walls and roof, with a hard-packed dirt floor. The dominant feature was an ornate brass bed frame. 10 scrawny chickens perched on the bare springs, each tied by the leg. The brass was green-hued and caked with generations of chicken manure. I watched a fresh-laid egg bounce from the hen's puckering butt down through the springs to the shit-crusted floor. They were small black chickens, like bantams, and reminded me a bit of snakes when their heads shot forward snapping at flies. Manure ammonia blended with fish smell. Flies swarmed in protest at my invasion of their sanctuary. Near the hooch doorway, against the wall, a large dented copper pot simmered on a low charcoal brazier. I realized that was the source of the fish smell. I hooked the lid of the simmering pot with shotgun muzzle and peeked. Fish heads and entrails rolled lazily in bubbling broth, flies hovering just beyond the heat halo. "What the hell stinks in there?" Crow asked, sticking his head in the back door. "How can you breathe?" "Lunch is cooking. Are you hungry?" "I'm glad it's you in there, not me." Near the brazier stood a long, low cabinet, doors askew on broken hinges. Gallon jugs of Nuc Mam, Vietnamese fish sauce, rested in a corner. On the floor near the brazier lay an assortment of vegetable greens and roots, stock to be added to the fish head broth, I assumed. An oil lamp covered in spider webs and fly scat hung from a bare overhead roof brace in the dim, windowless interior. In the far corner, a pile of bedding lay wadded on the floor. Retreating from the hooch, I shouted to Buddha that the people were just farmers and fishermen, no sign of them supporting the Viet Cong. Crow, Dennis, and I returned to the boat. Several young children, standoffish when we first arrived, now trailed us. They'd never seen Caucasians or black men in their lives. We gave them sea rations, showed them how to open the cans and packets, and quickly gained their confidence. I glanced shoreward. The old papasan hadn't moved. There was an old man just squatting on the riverbank when we first arrived. We must have fascinated the children. Vietnamese have no body hair. One child rubbed my arm, pulled the hair on it, then began rubbing my tattoo. When it wouldn't rub off, he spit on it and rubbed harder. I laughed and pushed him away, rumpling his hair in a playful gesture. He frowned and jumped back, and I realized I had committed a taboo. Vietnamese culture frowned on touching the top of another's head. Stonewall was surrounded by children. The boys, more bold, stroked his black skin like petting a puppy. The little girls looked on in silence. I snapped a picture, and several children darted from our boat back to the riverbank. I'd committed another taboo. In snapping the picture, I captured their spirit. On the main river, people were beyond such superstitions. That was kind of typical of our interaction with the Vietnamese people. We we never really had any problems with civilians. During the Uman Forest, it was pretty amazing. I've done a lot of research when I started organizing the book, and this was like a 10-day operation, and the Army and Navy really took no casualties, and yet they were very active. They destroyed tons and tons of enemy supplies and naturally eliminated some enemy. But the Viet Cong, the communists considered it a safe area. And I never saw them, but stories came back to us that inland from the rivers they had training sites and hospitals and R&R centers. And I would believe it because, like I say, nobody had been down in this area since 1954. I kind of felt sorry for this. One day that we were patrolling a sector of the river, because that's what we do when we insert troops. A few of the boats would stay along. Some would move forward, like I talked about earlier, and wait for them to come out. And some of us then would stay and patrol the river in between, waiting in case any enemy tried to cross the river, to escape across the river. Then we could stop them. Anyway, Army troops brought this fella out to us one time, and we're escorting him up to one of the barges that accompanied our operation. They had a holding cell there with South Vietnamese interpreters and interrogators. And I felt sorry for this guy. All I could think of is when we were going through our POW training, they pulled black bags over our heads, and you just felt so vulnerable because you didn't know what was going on afoot from you. And this is Buddha trying to look tough there. You can kind of see what a big man he is. He's about 6'4" or 6'5". So we completed that operation, and we had a couple of weeks of stand-down time, and then on early morning of August 18th, the Army or Navy got intelligence that there was a battalion of Viet Cong regulars up this canal, this Hau Mai Tam Canal. And so we took off. It wasn't very far from where we were on Mekong, actually. We took off, I suppose, at 10 in the morning, and we turned up, if you ever look on a map of Vietnam, up right by Kai Bay. There's a tributary that this canal goes north, and we went up that, and right around 2 o'clock, the boat I was driving was about midway in the group, and we were in the heart of the kill zone, and it was a battalion of Viet Cong regulars. They were very well disciplined, and they were good shots. The first 2 rockets detonated right here in the well deck, and we had a platoon of troops. We had about 30 guys on board, and when these 2 rockets detonated, they sprayed shrapnel down on the troops. And the third one, I had my armor plating up here naturally, and this picture was taken after the ambush, of course. But my armor plating in this picture is down. You can kind of see those little slits right there. That's what I had to look through, okay? But I had my face right up against that armor, trying to see the damage on the front of the boat, because the squadron commander was on the radio demanding our damage and everything because smoke was rising. And we took a third rocket right here, and the flash from that burst up, and some flash came in through my slits and showered more down on the troops. And it happened so fast. I beached the boat like I was trained to, and the sergeant, the Army sergeant, stuck his head up, and he told us to back off. He said, "Back off, there's no one left to put ashore." They had so many casualties from those first 2 rockets. And this all happened so fast. It was interesting when I wrote the book. It was like putting it in slow motion and figuring out what had happened, because all the years it was just kind of a collage of a nightmare. But I backed the boat off then, and there's a lot of smoke coming from it and everything naturally. Well, we took 2 rockets, we took 2 rockets right here on the Coxon Flat, and the first one knocked this bar armor away. This picture was taken, like I say, after the ambush, and someone stood the bar armor back up. It had been knocked away, and the second rocket came through that spot. These guys were very good shots, and they were very close. But the second rocket came through that opening and penetrated into my Coxon Flat. And the radioman and myself got kind of splattered with shrapnel. And a few moments later, I got back up and kept driving the boat and whatnot, but a few moments later, an Army sergeant, in the very beginning of the ambush, and some of you have read the book and know about this, but in the very opening moments of ambush, the Port 50 caliber gunner abandoned his post and ran below. And an Army sergeant stuck his head up and asked if we needed help after those first rockets had hit. Like I'm standing here at the helm, and the hatch down to the well deck was just on my right-hand side, and the sergeant stuck his head up through the hole and asked if we needed help, and I yelled to him, yes, getting that Port 50. And so he got in there and started putting out rounds, and he was in there probably less than 5 seconds, and a rocket penetrated right here, and he took the full brunt of it. You can see in this picture, besides the rockets, you can see the machine gun rounds we were getting also from the beach. And this is just a catwalk, and it's maybe 1/4 inch or 3/8 or whatever, and the bullets would go through that, but not through the 1-inch armor plating. So we were actually pretty well protected. This is kind of an interesting picture I found on the internet. This is a magazine reporter that visited our squadron, labeled it as the world's smallest aircraft carrier. Because in the Mekong Delta, between the rice paddies and the jungles, there weren't very many places for choppers to land. And so they devised these tiny landing pads on some of the tango boats. And that's what you see here. This fellow's coming in on a landing. And some of the medevacs, you've heard the expression as dust-offs. But thousands of Army troops and sailors down in the Delta were medevaced in this manner. This is how I was medevaced off one of these. And when I was medevaced out, I was taken out to the main river, and there was a USS Colleton. It was a APB, a barrack ship actually, but it had been converted to a hospital ship. And so this is where I spent my first night. This particular boat is actually the Benoit. I couldn't find a picture of the Colleton, but it's identical to this. But what I found interesting about it were, see these 2 tango boats in the background here. There were 4 to 5 large ships that were always moored out in the Mekong that supported our squadrons of riverboats. We had the barracks ships that the Army troops lived on. We had the hospital ship. There was a repair ship with huge barges, and they could lift our boats out to do maintenance on them. And then there were usually a couple of LSTs there. And so when we weren't on operations, we would be scheduled to patrol around 24 hours a day. We'd patrol around the group of large ships that were moored there to discourage enemy swimmers from planting mines. And we went through pallets of grenades, of concussion grenades, because you'd be throwing them over quite often into the water to, if there was a swimmer anywhere nearby, you would eliminate them. In November of 1968, a swimmer was successful, a Viet Cong swimmer. He planted a mine on an LST, the Westchester County, I believe. And it was very similar. When I saw the coal that got mined, some of you might remember that, it was really quite similar. It blew a big hole in the side of Westchester County, and 25 sailors were killed. So I spent my first night on the Colleton, and I had my first surgeries there where they removed some shrapnel. Excuse me a second. Don't want to be like Mark Rubio. But anyway, they removed some shrapnel and whatnot. And when I woke up in the morning, my eyes were just really burning and swollen and watering, and it felt like someone had thrown a handful of sand in them. And so they sent me, I was medevac to Army 3rd Hospital in Tonsonhoot. And the doctors there saw my eyes had gotten burned really bad, kind of like welder's flash is what it was. And so they bandaged them up because they didn't know how badly they were injured. And that was really a terrifying experience because I thought I was going blind. And so anyway, then I was transferred to Japan to, what was the name of it? 9th Army Hospital, 106th General Army Hospital in Yokohama, Japan. And I was there for several days. They removed a little more shrapnel, and amazingly, my eyes, there was an eye specialist there, and they put salve in them and worked with them, and by the end of a week, the bandages were gone, and I could actually see fairly well. It was kind of funny because they had me go see a eye doctor, and they set me up. I did some eye exams for glasses, and because I was in transit, the glasses ended up being sent to our farm up in Nebish. And you talk about the Coke bottle glasses, my eyes were still healing, and these lenses were really, really thick, and I never used them. I didn't even know they had sent them till I came home on that convalescent leave I mentioned earlier. My little brothers and sisters played with them for years. So from Japan, from the Army Hospital there, I was medevac back to the United States. And this is what we flew on. And I got this picture from Beverly Dawson's Images of America. She's a lady I met down with the History Center down in Glenview, Illinois. And we flew from Japan to Anchorage, Alaska, or Fairbanks, I never can remember which. Anyway, we landed, and they offloaded all the, and I should step back a moment. This plane was divided into 3 sections. This plane was divided into 3 sections, and the front section were seats facing backwards, where the walking wounded were transported, and that's where I was. Okay, I could walk and I could navigate. The middle section of the plane was set up for stretcher cases, and they were stacked 4 to 5 high, and that was always one of the images I carry with me, was these IV bags swinging in flight. And the back part of the plane was loaded with coffins that had been stacked on pallets and strapped down. And so anyway, we flew for, it seemed like countless hours staring backwards at these stretcher cases and the coffins. And I remember during that flight, one of the memories I have is I didn't know who all had been killed on August 18th, and I wondered if any of my friends were in those coffins. Well, we landed in Anchorage or Fairbanks, like I say, and offloaded all the wounded and the coffins that were destined for the West Coast, and then we continued on to Scott Air Force Base in southern Illinois, where again we landed and they offloaded the coffins and the injured that were going to the southeast and the east coast. And so then we proceeded on to Glenview Naval Air Station near Chicago. So I'm going to read a couple pages here. Just one thing I would note also, this hospital bus here, when we landed at Glenview, they took us off the plane, and then they loaded us onto these buses. Okay, so here we've just landed at Glenview. We touched down and taxied to the hangar. Everybody was silent. Everybody was silent, no doubt lost in his little universe of memories as the aircraft rolled to a stop. Hydraulics hummed, cargo bay doors opened, and the rear ramp lowered. First off, caskets. Next, stretcher cases were transferred to ambulances and buses. Last, we walked out the rear door of the plane. It was a bright autumny day, cool, clear. I was surprised not to smell burning leaves. We loaded onto gray Navy buses for the ride north to the hospital. As our bus meandered across the base, I smelled fresh mown grass along the boulevards where marigolds and pansies sparkled in the breeze. Sailors, working slowly, picked weeds from flower patches. Tending lawns seemed somehow surreal. Nearing the gate, we stared at men in crisp uniforms saluting each other, shiny cars passing through. It was a world we had forgotten. Then we were beyond the security of the base. Well, kiss my butt. We got a welcoming committee out here, said a small man sitting near the front of the bus. I was further back, behind the stretchers that flanked both sides. I moved forward in the aisle. A large group of people stood on the sides of the street holding signs welcoming us home. Eggs and tomatoes splattered the windshield. Wipers smeared a pasty reddish-yellow crescent. The bus slowed and a ripple of noise washed over us. Anti-war protesters blocked the street in front and behind the bus. We couldn't move. We were surrounded by the mob. They screamed and waved flags, waved signs. They attacked with rotten fruit, tomatoes, bricks. As they gained courage, they began hitting the bus windows with clubs, fists, and protest signs, screaming obscenities and lies. I thought of the pack of wild dogs that had attacked a doe when I was 12. It was early winter. I was out checking muskrat traps. First I heard the yapping, then the doe burst through a clump of willows and out onto the ice, where she stood quivering. A few seconds later, 5 mangy-haired dogs broke from the slough, skidded onto the ice, and surrounded the trembling deer. The protester shouts blended to an indistinguishable blur in my ringing ears. Beyond the stretcher, beyond the garbage-splattered window, a girl's hate-filled face twisted as her mouth stretched wide, screaming at us. I caught snatches. Killers, rotten hell, pig lackeys. She reminded me of the prostitute in Saigon, the way her face had twisted after the drunken soldier stomped it. But then I recalled the girl sitting beneath the eucalyptus tree in Golden Gate Park the weekend Professor Dennis and I had visited Haight-Ashbury. Excuse me. Okay, visited Haight-Ashbury. This screaming girl beyond the bus window was so angry. The one beneath the tree had smiled at me. Had that been only 8-9 months ago? How could people change so fast? Bricks thudded against the bus. It edged forward when the mob tried to force the doors open. I was at a loss when I looked into the raging faces of the young people banging fists against the windows. Professor had talked about people protesting the war, but nothing about hating us. These were people my age. What had I done to them? So I sat on that memory for quite a few years, didn't really talk to anyone about it. And in 2007, by 2007 I had been doing several years of writing, and I attended a lot of writing workshops, just learning the writing craft. And I attended the Northwoods Writers Conference at Bemidji State University the summer of 2007. And I had submitted this chapter I just read an excerpt from to the professor that was doing the workshop that I had registered for. And he gave me quite a scathing critique, basically that I was lying about this incident. And in the class, he said, anti-war protesters were nonviolent. My parents were anti-war protesters. They would never have done something like this. And quite a few of the workshop students were of our generation, and they all told him he was full of BS. And he didn't know. And after the workshop, it really troubled me because here was this, and this guy was quite a well-known professor. He had been on Hannity and Combs, and he had written an open letter to the Boston Globe about Condoleezza Rice and got fired. And so he was pretty active left-winger. Well, anyway, it really bothered me that here was this professor who had been taught revisionist history, and he was in a position to continue passing these lies and untruths forward. And so I thought I need to figure out what happened that day because it just wasn't logical what happened. So my wife and I drove down to Chicago, and I had called that Bev Dawson I mentioned earlier. She was in charge of the Glenview Historical Society, and then I had also called the Glenview Library. And so when I went down there, people were familiar with what I was looking for. And at the library, I almost instantly realized what happened. This volunteer helped me pull up some old microfiche of 1968 newspapers, and by rare coincidence, here was this front page picture in a Chicago paper of stacked rifles at Glenview Naval Air Station. And as it turned out, it was August 29th, 1968, the most violent day of the Democratic National Convention riots in Chicago. And Mayor Daley had requested military have backup for his Chicago Police Department. And when these buses pulled off the base, these protesters, they were well organized. They were already in position to stop the reinforcements they thought were going down to Grant Park, down to Chicago to help beat up protesters. And so that was the conclusion we all came to, that these protesters in their rage and whatever misunderstood and didn't realize that we were going in the opposite direction. And this Steve Almond, actually I came home and I wrote an article for this Vietnam magazine. It's kind of a history magazine about the Vietnam War. And I used part of this Steve Almond, the professor's critique, in the article, and I contacted him and sent him a copy of the article I had written. And I needed his permission to use his writing in this article. So he said yes, that was fine. And so I'll write, he ended up, we actually became friends. He ended up editing the book, and he wrote the foreword for it. I'll read just a little bit of what he wrote here. And this is just the first couple of paragraphs here. I met Wendell Affield at a writing workshop in northern Minnesota. Workshops can be strange settings for a simple reason that a group of strangers must come together to discuss highly personal work. Wendell's piece was especially charged. It was an excerpt from a memoir that dealt with his return from Vietnam, where he had served on a gunboat in the Mekong Delta. The piece was striking for its unflinching honesty. He was able to capture the sense of desolation experienced by veterans of the war with restrained dignity. But there was one passage that stood out. Wendell recounted an incident in which a number of anti-war protesters stormed a bus transporting him and other wounded veterans. And I'll move forward here. And this is when I contacted him again. A few months after the workshop, rather out of the blue, I received a note from Wendell, along with an article he'd written about the confrontation with the anti-war protesters. Wendell had returned to the scene of the episode, talked with some of the locals, and done considerable archival research in an effort to reconstruct what had happened. As it turned out, the anti-war protesters apparently had confused the bus Wendell was on with one that was transporting members of the National Guard to Chicago, where the bloody riots of the 1968 Democratic National Convention were in full swing. So I was impressed that this person had the time for me, and even though he was very polarized liberal, he was open-minded enough to recognize that he had made a mistake. So I was impressed with that. In the early 90s, a friend of mine was sent down to Topeka, Kansas to a PTSD treatment center. And he returned a couple months later or whatever with a reunion flyer for Mobile Marine Force reunion. And I called the phone number on it and spoke to a guy that actually organized the association named Albert Moore. And he said, you must have been on Buddha Ed Thomas's boat. And I said, yeah. So he gave me Buddha's phone number. And Buddha lived in the UP, and we reconnected, and he came over. This is a VFW dinner in 1991 that he and I attended together. And it was, before the time that Al Gore invented the internet, so communication and locating friends wasn't quite as easy as it is today. But during the following years, we attended quite a few reunions together. This is one in Chattanooga. We went to one in Fort Mitchell, Kentucky, another one. And we had some good times. It was good to reconnect with a lot of the guys. This is me in Buddha's cabin. Buddha was single. He never married. He retired from the Navy as a master diver. And it was really quite sad. He would never say he had PTSD, but he had a severe case. He was a very heavy drinker. He isolated, if you're familiar with the UP at all, he lived on a little highway way back in the sticks south of Munising, about 30 miles. And there's just, when first time I drove there, he drew me a map. And I'm following this dirt trail with grass growing in the middle of it, like an old logging trail, and I followed it for a couple miles back into the brush, and I finally got to it. But pretty secluded. But this is a picture of us in the mid-90s. This is the flag off Tango 11. And you can see his house is pretty basic. He died in 1999. He had an brain aneurysm. They found him in his cabin. After he passed away, his sister contacted me, and she didn't really want much of his Vietnam paraphernalia. And she gave it to me, including a lot of his pictures. All the Vietnam pictures I have here are from his estate. When I was medevac, none of my belongings ever caught up with me, so I had pictures and stuff, and I never saw them again. But just as I was telling Marty earlier, I think, this in July, the Minnesota Military Museum over at Camp Ripley had a grand opening of the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War, and they have quite an elaborate display there. And I would encourage people to go over and visit it. It's truly amazing. I know I was there last year for a book signing, and they had, it might still be there, I didn't get a chance to look in July, but they had this Civil War exhibit there. And the thing that just fascinated me, there was this little metal bowl with some little bits of iron in it, of metal inside the bowl. And the caption under it said, "Cannonballs that met in midair at the Battle of Gettysburg." Now, can you even begin to imagine something like that? But anyway, I donated the flag and all the original Polaroids that I have from my Vietnam experience to the museum there. In 2013, Patty and I attended a reunion down in Indianapolis, and about a year earlier, I got an email from a fella, that this guy on the end here, What'd I do, Marty? Oh, there it is, okay. But this fellow right here named Larry, he sent me an email. He had found my book on Amazon, and he was in Weldick. He was one of the troops that got wounded on August 18th. And he thanked me for writing the book and mentioned a few things that he had forgotten. And one thing that he says, I thought I was imagining things. He says, I thought I saw a medevac chopper get shot down. But he says, thank you for telling me that it happened. He says, I thought I was going crazy trying to imagine it. But because in the book I mentioned that I saw a helicopter or a medevac chopper shot down. But I at the reunion, I'll read this. It's on my blog, but I'll read it. On the first day of the reunion, Larry introduced himself. We compared notes on how our lives have evolved over the past 4 decades. The second day of the reunion, he came up to me. I had a table where I was selling books there. Aunt Larry came up to me and said, I found 3 guys who were in the Weldick on August 18th. It was an intense experience. Larry McCormick looked at me, frowned, and shook his head. I thought you were dead these past 45 years. Why would you think that? I said. Because of all the blood dripping down from your coxswain flat above me, and the boat kept running into things. Well, every time rockets struck, whether they came through or not, just the concussion, you can't begin to imagine the concussion of something like that. Every time one hit even close, I would get knocked down, okay? And so I'd lose control of the boat, and it was a narrow river, so sometimes you'd run into things. Anyway, okay, each time the rockets hit my armor plating, I kept getting knocked down, I told him. He asked an unusual question then, one I've never thought about. How many times were you hit? I have always considered the ambush one action, not multiple injuries. I thought a time and told him 4, I suppose. We all visited then and recalled that hot Sunday afternoon, and I thought again how each of us remembered differently, yet there were some memories held by all. The most powerful was blood splattered everywhere, blood trickling across the Weldick, heroism of already wounded men cradling smoldering crates as they struggled across a slick deck to throw grenades and ammo overboard before it exploded. I brought up the Black Army sergeant who had come up to man our abandoned 50 caliber machine gun. I told again how he had been severely maimed when a B-40 rocket burned through the armor and he took a direct hit. Cleve Chick recalled that he was a career man who had recently joined the platoon, so most of the men didn't know him. Thomas, Cleve said. His last name was Thomas. Larry gave me a list of 23 Army men who were on Tango 11 who received a Purple Heart for wounds received on August 18th. 2 names are missing, Hector Luco Malika, who was killed in action, and the black sergeant named Thomas. I wonder if Sergeant Thomas was a senior man on board Tango 11. I believe in the chaos of the day, his act of heroism went unnoticed and unrecorded. I would very much like to identify the sergeant. If he did not survive his wounds, his family deserves to know his actions. If he did survive and is still alive, I would very much like to meet him. So this article ran a couple months later in our association newsletter, and there's about 1,500 old riverboat sailors and Army troops that get that newsletter. Well, within about a week, I got an email from a guy named Lorne that said, he says, I have pictures of Thomas, I remember him. And so here's the mysterious Sergeant Thomas. Yeah. And a few months ago, well, I suppose 6 or 7 months ago now, I received an email. Hi, Wendell, my name is Ron Pease. Echo 6, as Lauren refers to me. Boy, do I remember Sergeant Thomas. I was commanding officer of Echo Company from January to August 1968. Thomas was a great friend and soldier. Very, very dependable. I do not know where he is, but if you find him, will you please let me know? about where he is or what happened to him. He was great, and I love him like a brother. And I did learn that Sergeant Thomas is buried in Durham, North Carolina. He did survive. I was amazed that he survived. But he was a career man, and he retired from the Army. Actually worked in Army intelligence, I learned, and retired in 1986, about the same year Buddha retired. And this past, well, I learned that he was buried in Durham, North Carolina, so I contacted the Durham Library, and I got an address of a Juanita Thomas, and I emailed her and tried to track her down, and I had her address, and there was no email, no phone number, I couldn't contact her, and her address sat on my desk for about a month, and I thought, duh, when am I going to write her a letter? So I did. I wrote her a letter, and I sent her a book, and she contacted me, and she was Sergeant Thomas's widow, and they had 3 children, and actually this past Memorial Day, his daughter called me, and we had quite a long visit. This is an American Legion convention where I gave the governor a book. The Mobile River Reinforced Association, perhaps some of you have seen this museum. 2 years ago, I had it come up to Beltrami County Fair. It has all the KIAs, the Army, Navy, and Coast Guard actually listed on the walls on both sides. It's kind of like a mini wall of just our units. And inside is maps and weapons and paraphernalia from the Vietnam War. And they also have, it's really neat, they have like must be 12 feet long. It's a model of one of the river boats that they pull out and put under an awning when they're doing displays. So I know at the fair it generated a lot of interest. In the early 90s, back up a moment, when I was discharged from the Navy in 1969, they sent me to the VA in Chicago. And I had an exam there and whatnot, and they gave me 0% disability rating for my hearing. My ears have ringing in them real loud all the time. And then they gave me 10% disability for scars from my shrapnel. And so I was getting a $14 check. It really enhanced our lifestyle. But years went by, and I never went to VA, and we moved from Chicago. I eventually ended up in Milwaukee, where I was managing a butcher shop, but that company closed down. We moved back to Bemidji area in 1985, where I went to work at Lucan's, 1980 actually. But in the early 90s, I got a appointment from the VA for Agent Orange physical, and I went in, and the young doctor there noted that I was already in the system, and that kind of surprised him because at that point a lot of Vietnam veterans weren't. And he asked me what happened, and I showed him the shrapnel scars, and he asked me what happened. And like those old World War II vets that had visited me at Lucan's, I started tearing up and got choked up. And I felt foolish and didn't understand what was going on. And he asked me if I had ever been checked for PTSD. And I said, what's that? And so he made an appointment, and I visited with a shrink and ended up getting disability for PTSD. And so they encouraged me at that time to join this group in Bemidji of veterans. And it's amazing. I know Park Rapids, this whole northern Minnesota has a high population of veterans, regardless of what war you were in. And I think, like up by me, A lot of it is just the seclusion. People like to be, they like to be isolated. I know like Beltrami County has a higher than normal population of Vietnam veterans, and one of the reasons up there, I think, is because we have a high population of Native Americans, and they're very patriotic and high incident of veterans on the reservations. But anyway, this is the group that I participated in for quite a few years. Actually, it was disbanded when the technician or facilitator, whatever, lost his license. But this is on a trip that we went to the wall, and really sad, one of the fellas here committed suicide just 2 months ago. I think after 40 some years, but he just got tired of dealing with his demons and put an end to it. And, you know, people often ask me why I wrote the book, and I kind of talk about those World War II veterans that walked away shaking their heads, because I came to the realization that if I didn't tell my story, it would go the same way as theirs, and the same way as millions of other veterans' stories have gone. And I thought, you know, I didn't want that. And I think another thing, as we age, I think we want to try and make some sense of our life and make some peace with what has happened. A couple messages I've received since Muddy Jungle was published that I might share, and this is an Amazon review. Sometimes I look calm, cool, and collected on the outside, but the inside will be going 90 to nothing, and the mind will be back in that world. I think this book eased a few of those feelings by just knowing that someone else that has been in the exact same spot as me was having the same thoughts and feelings. Maybe it justified my feelings or something like that. Since I'm not a writer, it's hard to put into words. And here's a comment I got on a blog entry I made. I cannot believe I'm revisiting your book. By strange chance, my daughter asked me if I had read Muddy Jungle Rivers, and I was stunned to find that it was being used as a teaching tool at Indiana University's sociology program. What an excellent teaching tool and guide to understanding PTSD. I really enjoyed conveying your story and the emotion she showed listening to your story. I truly respect and honor you and your fellow soldiers for serving our country in a war that was misunderstood, mishandled, and never recognized properly. God bless and care for all of our veterans. You should be proud. From his tone, I would assume that he wasn't in the military, but kind of like that professor I was talking about earlier, you know, he's come to the realization that it wasn't things that we troops did in Vietnam, it was what our government did, the politicians. I read a statistic not too long ago that 30% of veterans today that the VA are treating are being treated for PTSD. And sometimes when I'm doing book events, people ask me, well, what should we do as families? And I guess the first thing I would say is to give them space, you know, and don't, if they want to talk about the past, let them talk. Listen to them and don't judge them, but don't pressure them for what they did, he or she, in today's world. If they want to, if in their time, they'll tell about it. One of the things that I've learned personally is that writing is a wonderful therapy, and it's a recognized therapy for PTSD. Walter Reed Army Hospital and the National Endowment for the Arts collaborated several years ago on a nonprofit writing project. It's called Veterans Writing Project. You can Google it. There's a lot. Jungle